half girl, half god, all heroine. You're listening to Ranking Rick Riordan, a podcast about Percy Jackson and the whole wide rest of the Riordanverse. I'm Dan.
I'm Olga.
And I'm Clara. And today,
Ranking Rick Riordan presents Ranking Rick Riordan Presents.
In this episode, we present Aru Shah and the End of Time.
This show is available on youtube.com/DoingOK and podcast services around the world. Let's get into it.
And we actually have video this time. So if you like video, let us know because this is a lot of extra work. And we had technical problems.
Boy, howdy.
Yes. So the way we're going to do this Aru Shah stuff and all of Rick Riordan Presents going forward is we're always going to start spoiler-free and see, do we recommend this book? And we're going to have a system where we each say, do we not recommend it? Do we recommend it? Or do we highly recommend it? And then once we talk about it for a while, we will say, okay, here's the cutoff point. We're going to go into spoilers now. And so I don't know, this video itself might just be spoiler free. We'll see how things go timing wise. But to start off, I have a disclaimer.
I was waiting for that.
To start off, I have a disclaimer. As we dive into talking about these books that come from cultural perspectives outside of our own, we'll do our best to be as respectful as possible. That said, if we get something wrong, please let us know over at our podcast feedback at gmail.com so we can correct it in the future.
Yeah.
Just something I wanted to hit on. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Spoiler free. Thoughts, Clara?
Highly recommend, so recommend. I don't know if I was supposed to say that. I love this book. I love it so much. That's it. That's my spoiler-free initial review.
Yes.
All right. I'm going to follow Clara's lead here and just say highly recommend as well. I actually already recommended it. I've already had time to recommend it to a person.
Two people I've recommended it so far.
I'm slacking.
Actually, 3.
Yeah. Whoa. Yeah. One of my coworkers, she really likes Rick's work. And she said that she got Aru Shah like ages ago and she started to read it and she doesn't even remember if she finished it. She knows she liked it. I was like, read it, keep going, you'll love it. And she's like, I trust your opinion. I'm gonna dive back in.
Yeah.
And that's it, where I'm just like, I don't know how you stop. Like, now that all the books are out, because she read it before they were out, you can't stop. You just have to, you read this one and you're gonna be you're gonna be hooked.
I haven't started reading the second one. It's killing me.
Yeah,
it is killing me slowly.
Yeah.
I actually bought another of the author's books to like fill the gaping hole in my heart left by not being able to read the second book yet.
Yeah.
Oh man. Okay, so I highly recommend as well, I'm happy to say, because I had some issues with it here and there. But overall, I think it is a very, very good book. I think it does so many things well. I think the character work is probably the best part of the book.
Mm-hmm.
I think Aru is awesome. I love how active she is. I love that she's imperfect. She has a lot of things to work through. I almost said a spoiler, so I'm not going to keep doing that. But Minnie is awesome. Lots of great character stuff. Clara, what did you love about it?
I loved the writing.
Mm-hmm.
I thought this was just beautiful writing. The whole thing, if you like fairy tales, this whole book feels like a rich, just like a tapestry of a fairy tale, And you tell me if you don't want me to do this, but I found like a quote it's on page 9 of the book.
That's fine. It's page 9.
So, okay. Yeah. Okay. So this is like just to give people a little taste of what this writing is like. 4 p.m. is like a basement, wholly innocent in theory. But if you really think about a basement, it is cement poured over restless earth. It has smelly, unfinished spaces and wooden beams that cast too sharp shadows. It is something that says almost, but not quite. 4 p.m. feels that way too. Almost, but not quite afternoon anymore. Almost, but not quite evening yet. And it is the way of magic and nightmares to choose those almost, but not quite moments and wait. And oh my God, I read that and I have a little note and it says, with a lot of H's on it because This book is so good.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out, that in particular, because I remember reading that and it like washed over me, and you reading it again, I have goosebumps. And that's the thing, where just the voice of Aru, of this world, like it's just a really comforting, familiar, well-written voice.
I think that there's lots of great, like, sort of poetic-y moments like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to get into criticisms yet, so Olga, what do you think?
I mean, I just agree completely. Like, the heart of this really does lie with the characters, and Aru and Minnie's relationship is really special. I really appreciate it, and their like newfound sisterhood. I feel like I can relate to Aru. Like, she reminds me of myself as a kid who had a lot of imagination and maybe not a ton of friends, but and like finding someone. But I also see myself in Minnie too, who's like cautious and like book smart, but not like confident in herself. And so there's just like something really nice about having them come together and support each other and like see through each other's flaws. Like, they can still be annoyed by each other, but they work together and they bring out the good sides of each other.
Something that I think is really great about this book is it follows the path set by Lightning Thief pretty closely. Like, there's a lot of comparisons that we're going to talk about, right?
Mm-hmm.
As far as like the literal plot. But at very, very few moments did it feel like that in a bad way. Like, it was not like, oh, I've been here, done that. If anything, it was more like, oh, I like your take on this, or this reminds me of that in a good way.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it felt less like Lightning Thief and more like the archetype of hero's journey quest motif. Like, it felt to me again and again, like this just felt like reading a detailed fairy tale that got like drawn out and had rich characters. So like, I won't get too into it, but the quest format, the things that they're looking for are like really interesting. Whereas in Lightning Thief, it's a little more sort of like, and we need to go to these different places.
But if you're thinking about like the goal of where they're going and why they're going there, and you know, something like a very similar thing to the Medusa stuff happens, and you know, all that sort of stuff. There's definitely a lot of similar stuff.
I mean, it's the thing of like, yes, Rick didn't invent the hero's journey. No. He didn't even invent like putting something, you know, old into a modern lens, but he popularized it. So I will say that like at times, especially initially, I would say especially through that first third, I did feel this weird uncanny valley where I was like, this is how some of Rick's books start, but this isn't his voice.
But it was also pretty close at time, because I think the humor is very Rick.
Yes. Yeah, the humor is. And like the way Aru is like sassy. Speaks to, you know, reminded me of Percy a little bit, but that's not a bad thing. And that's not to say that like there isn't originality here. I'm just saying that like, oh, but she's speaking from a culture that just isn't Rick's. That's what I mean more about the voice.
And I mean, like, even beyond the culture, I would just say, like, her writing style is so different from Rick's. And I really love Rick's. It feels very much sort of like a movie or a TV show almost. Like, it's snappy and the action is really well choreographed. And, like, this feels like reading an epic tale. Like, I don't know, the style is very different and it's still really visceral. And Rick's writing is also visceral, but this is like in a very different way. This uses metaphor.
I would say it's really like cool emotionally way, much more emotional than his is.
Yeah, it's a different tone.
But that does bring up a few issues that I personally have, and that's I it's going to be hard not to be comparing things to Rick stuff because, I mean, that's what this podcast kind of is. So I'll just say, like, while we said very positive things, especially in Lightning Thief, about the way that Rick wrote action, I think that is slightly lacking here for me. I don't think it's bad, but I do think that there is plenty of times where I can't really picture the blocking of the scene. I'm not quite sure where everyone is in relation to each other. And I'm not as, like, in it as I was, at least not as in the action specifically. And I also thought that the pacing of the action at certain times felt a little off. It felt to me like it took a very long time to get to what I would consider the really first action sequence, which I would say is when they're in the hairdresser area. So to me personally, the first, I'd say, like, from the 10% mark to the 30% mark, I was having some trouble personally. But
I do agree with you about the action sequences. And I would say that maybe some of that is an expectation of the Rick Riordan presents. Like, that's the thing. We're going to compare it to Rick's, right? Because it's through the lens of it. It's his, like, name branding on these things. So, like, I feel for these authors who have, like, at the same time they're being helped by the opportunity of that, but at the same time it does invite some comparison. We're on record as, like, praising Rick for feeling like I'm on the edge of my seat, as if I was watching something, watching a movie, watching something. I have to turn the page and I can see it playing out in my mind. Yeah, that's just my only critique. And I do think it got better as the book went on.
Agree.
But that was it. It was just not as visually clear to me.
For me, that is much less about this book and more about Lightning Thief. Like, for me, that's one of the things that makes Lightning Thief really good. There are, for me, if we are, like, comparing these two, I would write this higher. I know we're not doing that, but, like, overall, the things about it that I like so much. But specifically the action scenes, like, that's where Lightning Thief shines. And that's, I think, one of the places Rick really shines as a writer too, is he's so, like, he's really good at writing an action sequence. But this never felt, like, bad to me. Like, I didn't notice it as being detrimental.
I did notice it as not just as a comparison point to Rick. There were scenes where I was confused about where people were and stuff like that. Or where it felt like things were taking, like, it felt like the action was taking too long, in that, like, it felt like they were pausing within the action, or, like, it's a little hard to explain, but especially if I can't say a specific example because I don't want to spoil it.
Right.
But I do want to quickly say that it's not just about comparing. I feel like the reason I'm specifically comparing with Lightning Thief is that like we're saying, it is the archetypical hero's journey. And so when I read Paula Santiago a while back, and that doesn't follow, in my opinion, the same sort of structure. So I wasn't comparing it to Rick quite as much. But for here, to me, it feels like it's hitting a lot of the same notes.
Well, it's a thing of girl finds out she is related to mythological gods of a religion, of a culture. In Aru's case, she is more familiar with the culture than Percy is, but nonetheless, she finds out this whole thing is real, and then she finds out the world is, like, apocalyptic stakes, and she goes on a quest with a trio to retrieve items in order to help stop it, and there's a fight. Like, a fight is coming. So just in that sense, like,
I don't think it's a spoiler to say that the goal is to get to the underworld.
Oh, I wasn't even thinking about that.
The goal is to get to the underworld to save her mom. That's, like, literally 1-to-1 Lightning. So that's...
Well, but her mom isn't I mean, it's
you know what I mean.
It's different.
Her driving goal, her main driving goal is save her mom. Percy's main driving goal is save his mom. So that's what I'm saying. And I also, there's the claiming sort of stuff, all that.
But again,
they both start in a museum.
That is a good point. I forgot about that. But that's the thing, like, all of these things, even I think that I would find myself going, like, oh, that reminds me of the Lightning Thief, even without the like Rick imprint on it.
Yeah.
And I think you mentioned he was the editor.
Yeah, he did.
Yeah, he edited this book as well. But going back to Aru and Minnie and their story, as Clara put it, of like it feeling like a fairy tale, and it's because it's following a specific epic. Like it's following like the saga of a family, which is something a lot more familiar in fairy tales. Like that's something that I grew up with like Slavic folklore and like Eastern European folklore as well. So in a lot of ways that way, it was, I agree with you, Clara, even though I didn't identify it at the time, it does lean more in that direction of like the feuds and the things, and the gods really are more just like a little level back.
Yeah, they do feel much more at an arm's length.
Yeah.
And I think so. To me, look, I don't want to be super negative, because I do want to be clear. I really enjoyed this book, but I do have things I want to talk about. So like, I also felt personally like there was a little bit too much filler. There's a little too many set pieces. There's a few that I'm just like, that didn't really add anything to me. And it just felt like we're meeting another group of people for the 12th time. But there's other ones where we're meeting really, really awesome people, and they leave such an impact, and it's really cool. I don't know if it's just on me or what, but like, I felt like the rules of the world and like what the actual goals were and things like that, I found kind of confusing. Like, which maybe we might have to go into spoilers for that to be more detailed. But like, what was going to happen when, and how the bad guys' plan affected their plan, and how their plan affected the bad guys' plan, to me was a little confusing. And I also felt like there was just a few times where I was like, oh, why is this person associated with these people? And then like, I don't feel like we ever actually learn the answer. Again, it's hard to say these things without spoilers.
Yeah, because I'm actually not even sure who you're referring to.
Yeah, same. I just want to say I didn't feel like anything in this book was filler or like, at least I was never bored for a second, and I never thought one thing I love about this book is there was never any piece where I was like, oh, this is just funny and for kids.
Yes.
Like, there were things that were funny, but it never felt like it was just for kids. And there was never anything, none of the set pieces were like, this is just a joke about this thing. Like, everything felt like it's world building, and it's like, it's just it's showing like how expansive the world is, how many different players there are, to Olga's point too. Like, it's not just about the gods being the main players. They're like all these different kinds of immortal and not immortal beings. Like, I don't know. I enjoyed like every second.
That's my question, Clara. Do you have a critique?
Do I have a critique? I'm sure as we go into the individual pieces, there are probably things, but like, honestly, like, this book is like so up my alley. I just can't, like, just the writing style, like from the second, and like Aru is so my type of heroine. Like, she grows up in a museum. Like, are you kidding? That's my dream. That's been my dream to live in a museum. Like, I don't know. I love this book.
I think that there's a lot of really like great wish fulfillment moments, like the whole idea of the like finding out you have this like soul sister thing. Like, that I can picture like as a kid being like, oh my god, that would be so cool if I met this awesome person and they were my best friend now, and all that stuff. Like,
I mean, I think that maybe one of the reasons it feels like I'll just say the chapters were like really short. There were a ton of chapters. So it was a really quick read because it felt so broken into bite-sized pieces. In part because there were so many little like transitions to a different place or meeting a different character. In some ways I could see that being because, and what you see as filler, maybe, Dan, for me was like, oh my God, she's so excited. Roshani Chokshi is like so excited to share this like mythology and culture with readers. If you're from the culture, it's here, you get to see it again through my lens and relate to it. If you're like us and less familiar with like Hindu mythology, be introduced to how like vast and epic it is. So I could see it just being like, I want to get as much in there as possible because actually these things are all tied together in some ways. And like, let's play the greatest hits.
Yeah.
So in that way, I think to me, that's where it can feel a little like overstuffed because there might be like a side quest where you're like, oh, maybe save that and like expand on it later. But there's this excitement of fleshing out this world and letting Aru meet it. And then you have Minnie there as well, who acts as someone who's more familiar too. That's not a major spoiler. It's just like that they are two people who are similar but different. They each have their strengths and their own knowledge bases. And that way you can find someone to relate to. I just love the fact that there's also no like annoying sidekick. There's no like annoying.
No,
there's no
like,
Grover.
There's nothing.
Or Meg. Book one, Meg.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I mean also like the side characters, like minor characters, and I won't go into any specifics, although it's killing me, but like you'll have a minor character and somehow they will have this full arc that has like an element of tragedy and like an edge of melancholy and everything is like, oh, it's all epic.
But what I'll say there, I know who some of the people you're talking about, Clara, and I think that at least the ones that come to my mind, they're all in the latter half to like 2/3 to half. And yet we're meeting other characters in that first third that Dan kind of cites beyond that like first introduction point, and those are the ones who don't get an arc but are still introduced. And that to me really is my only like criticism of like, if you're not going to give a character or a set piece an arc, then maybe that means it wasn't
super necessary,
vital.
Yeah, I mean, I also think something that's interesting is, we have this graphic novel of it right over here, which I think the art and stuff, a lot about it's really cool. It sort of for and against my argument here, they cut out major things in this book. And for me, so that shows that you could argue that shows, hey, there's filler. It's not necessary to know for the story. But they also cut out my favorite part of the entire book. So like that, it's, I don't know how that I walk away from that. As a positives, I want to say I think the climax is fantastic. I think the villain is fantastic. I think some of the twists I'm like, why did I not see that coming? But like, there's some good stuff.
I mean, we actually talked about it where you finished it slightly before I did.
Yeah.
And I was like, I totally could have figured that out. I just wasn't trying to.
Yeah.
Like, there's something about just going on the journey of this book that was really just nice.
Yeah.
It's because it feels like a fairy tale. Like you can know even like it just doesn't. It's. I love this book.
Yeah.
Everyone, if you haven't read it, please read it. It's so good.
It's just really sweet and interesting.
I have two last critiques.
Oh, of course you do. How much of them do you think could be explained by the fact that you listened to it versus read it?
I listened to all of these books.
I know, but not every book is going to lend itself to.
I don't think that has any effect.
All right.
Personally.
All right.
But so one of them is I think that the post-climax denouement, if you want to call it that, it went on way too long for my liking. It felt like the book was over, and then now let's have like a bunch of extra chapters that didn't need to be in this book. Yes.
Counterpoint. I saw that and I was like, oh my God, we're getting this moment of relaxation instead of a second big bad fight or like we have to do this another time. Like for me, I was just like, okay, cool, we can have this other, but I think it feels very counter to a lot of the Rick's books where there's the climax, and then there's the other climax, and then it stops.
I think you're setting it up against something else that we do critique. But I would say if you look at Lightning Thief, it does not have the second climax, and it has a very nice, solid denouement.
Well, maybe we should move Lightning Thief up higher.
These are not going on the same list, but also I want to counter your point, Dan. I actually wanted the denouement to be longer.
Me too. I never wanted this book to end. I think part of it was because I knew I couldn't go straight on to the second.
Fair.
But
Well, my rationale is a spoiler for like what I wanted in the denouement or what I wanted in the book to happen that didn't get to happen. And maybe that's because it just is going to be a much larger piece of book 2, and I could see it being like like a through line or major character conflict in the second book. So in that sense,
I wonder if it's the same thing. I think because I think part of the reason it bothered me was that there was something that I was like, this needs to happen in the denouement, and it didn't.
Yeah.
And instead we got other stuff that again felt like filler to me. But
I think we're on the same page.
Yeah.
And you know what? If I were to have, if you forced me to say one thing that I didn't think this book was perfect at, it would be that I didn't get my wish for what happened in the end of this book. But I could see, I don't know. We'll just see. I need to see what the second book does.
And then my last thing I wanted to say is I want to say it and then I want to explain it too before you jump on it. I don't feel like I walk away from this book understanding the world of Hindu mythology nearly as well as I do some of the other books. And you could argue, sure, like I knew more about Greek and Roman stuff to begin with, but I didn't know much about Egyptian or Norse mythology. And I felt like pretty good about the Egyptian stuff after the first book. I felt like I had like the core tenets. I was just missing the details. Whereas here, it felt like I got a lot of like separate elements that were all interesting and a lot of specific myths and things that were all interesting, but I didn't feel like I had the full picture. Especially like they say early on that like one of the annoying kids is like, don't you have like 5,000 gods or whatever? And they kind of just like, yeah, whatever. But like, I don't feel like I understand what that actually is in practice in this world. I don't understand how the people interact with their gods as well as I understood in other series. And I also, just as a side question, should we even be using the word mythology here? Because isn't this like a current religion?
So I think talking about mythology, we just need to be like clear that we're talking about like stories about religion, stories about gods, ways of understanding the world that get told through story. Like I talk about Jewish mythology a lot and as a practicing Jew. But I do wonder, like, one thing that I was thinking about as I was reading this book was like what it would feel like to read this as someone who practices this religion. And just the relation of like person and God and what that dynamic feels like. I would love to hear from people because I don't have that experience reading one of these books yet.
Yeah.
But yeah, so in terms of like writing about what it feels like to practice this, or like what it looks like to practice this religion, because we could get that from Greco-Roman, Norse, and Egyptian mythology, because while there are definitely still people today who practice those religions, it's like reconstructed and, you know, sort of a little different from ancient practice. And they really didn't focus on the religious aspects of it. Yeah, I don't know that I walked away from any of those books knowing what it looks like to practice those religions.
Well, I felt like I guess understood like the core principles, like
the structure.
Yeah, like the structure, like what was their like world creation story? How did what are the most important gods and how do they interact with each other? You know, who's like a god of the people versus who is like more of a villain or what? Like, I mean, they mention the villain like once, I think, or twice.
Shiva?
The sleeper?
Shiva, yeah.
Oh. That's like the.
But I don't know whether he's a villain.
Yeah, that's what I wasn't sure about that either. And even the mechanic of like there are demons, but there are these other things that aren't demons, but I don't know what they are. I don't know. I just had a lot of questions.
I don't know. I didn't really feel that way. There's also a super, like, I don't know, it's like humorous and light but super informative glossary in the back that explains a lot. And I think that could be really helpful. Yeah, because so one of the things I got distracted by thinking about reconstructed pagan religions like Greco-Roman stuff. Anyway, I listened to a podcast once on the use of the like parenthetical comma. So that's when you're saying a sentence and then you like stop to explain what the thing means and then keep going. And one of the things I actually noticed in this book was how there are not always parenthetical commas. Like there aren't always these pauses to explain to someone who's not familiar. And what that does is I never felt like I couldn't understand something and the glossary was there so I could go look. But sometimes limiting the use of those explanatory devices means that for people who it is familiar to, it doesn't feel like this book isn't intended for you.
Yeah.
Because if you overuse those explanatory devices, it feels like it's for a non-familiar audience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I feel like the book strikes a pretty good balance, honestly, especially with the glossary.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is actually what I was trying to hint towards down with you listening towards it versus reading it. Yeah. Because for us, it's,
I didn't get the glossary. It comes as a PDF, but
but that's what I mean. Like you can't just flip to it. It's like a separate action to try to, like, I found myself flipping to it in order to mentally pronounce words a certain way, to understand where the emphasis with these, like, especially like multi-syllable
Well, on the flip side, I was being told.
And that's what you were told. So this is like the strength and weakness where we got the asides by being able to reference it and even getting some like anecdotes from the author about how things relate to her life from this, like from the culture. It was really cute and sweet, and that's where like the humor came from. But so it was like a weird strengths versus weaknesses of the method in which we consumed it. Thank you, the medium. I think that actually going back to like, this is a religion that is in practice. The fact is that, to emphasize Clara's point of it feeling like, you know, a fairy tale / legend, is the fact that we're de-emphasizing the gods and the religious practice and going more into, once upon a time there were these people and this is how they met the gods and this is how they and so that way it doesn't like delegitimize or
step on the toes of
like it doesn't make anything seem like out of character or a caricature, I should say, of those practicing Hinduism while still being like a sweet adaptation of something that people will be familiar with. And also there is the fact that India is huge. And even in the book, like Roshani Chokshi, she like talks about how like there is no like Indian single like you're gonna have regional differences, you're gonna have language barriers of that as well. Even like some of the gods and terms are gonna be different depending on where you're from. So even that, I think, makes it like an extra level of challenge of like needing to explain how things relate, because they're not always necessarily even going to be related to each other in the same way depending on where you're from.
And I have one other critique, but because of timing and how long we've gone on this, which went longer than I expected, we will sort of hit on it as we go through the recap in the next podcast, which will be spoiler-filled. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. And
read Aru Shah.
End
of time.
And then recommend it to other people.
Yes. 3 out of 3 highly recommends. That's what we should, that's how we should wrap up this kind of segment.
And also let us know what you thought of the book. Send us an email at ourpodcastfeedback@gmail.com. Leave us a comment on the YouTube and all that stuff. Leave us reviews. That would be awesome. Thank you guys so much for listening, and may the gods be ever in your favor.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.